The morning sun hadn't fully burned off the mist that hung low over the creek when I stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. The air carried that clean, earthy smell of wet grass and pine, the same smell I'd grown up with, the same smell my grandfather always said was freedom you can breathe. But freedom didn't feel like what I saw next. From my porch, I spotted something odd near the tree-line, thin sticks topped with bright red flags, fluttering like little warnings in the breeze. At first, I thought maybe the county had marked utility lines, but no one had called, no notice had come in the mail, and no one had knocked on my door. This was family land. Land that had been ours for 3 generations. I set my mug down hard, the porcelain clinking against wood. The closer I walked, the more my stomach tightened. Men I didn't recognize were down by the creek, moving with a practiced rhythm. They wore neon safety vests, carried tripods, and one of them adjusted a surveyor's scope like he owned the place. Another man hammered more red flags into the soil, right where my grandfather used to sit and fish with me on summer evenings. The sight burned. That creek wasn't just a patch of running water, it was memory, blood, and sweat. My grandfather, Walter, had worked himself ragged to keep this land when developers circled back in the 1980s. He'd won then, and I'd always thought those battles were behind us. But this felt like déjà vu. Only now, the war had come to my watch. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sharper than I'd intended. The man didn't even look up. One scribbled notes on a clipboard, another snapped photos with a tablet. I walked faster, fists tight at my sides. "This is private property," I barked when I reached them. "Who gave you permission to be here?" Finally, one of them looked up, a younger guy with a smug half-smile, the kind of smile people wear when they think you don't matter. "We're with the HOA patrol," he said, like that was supposed to mean something. "Just marking boundary lines. Routine procedure." "HOA?" I nearly laughed. "We're not part of any HOA. This land doesn't fall under your jurisdiction." The man shrugged and pointed at his clipboard. "According to our maps, it does now. If you've got a problem, take it up with your association president." The arrogance in his tone made my blood boil. I wasn't some clueless homeowner they could bully with fine print and technicalities. I was a construction engineer. I knew land rights, boundaries, and legal surveys. What I didn't know was why a group of strangers felt confident enough to march onto my property as if they owned it. "You don't set foot here without my say-so," I warned, stepping between him and the creek. "Pack your gear and leave." The other men paused, exchanging glances. For a second, I thought they'd back off. Instead, the smug one smirked and drove another red flag into the ground, slow and deliberate, like a challenge. That was the moment my grandfather's voice echoed in my head. He always said, when someone trespasses on your land, they're not just stepping on dirt, they're stepping on your history. Don't ever let them. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures, their faces, their equipment, the flags, the creek. Evidence. If they thought I'd be intimidated, they were dead wrong. But as I watched them keep working, acting as if my words were air, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't some mistake. This was planned. Organized. They weren't here by accident, they were here to take something. I didn't know who had sent them or why, but I knew one thing: they weren't going to stop just because I told them to. And that's when I realized I couldn't handle this alone. My grandfather, Walter, might have been 75, but he was sharper than men half his age. He'd fought battles like this before, and he still kept his old hunting rifle cleaned and ready. If anyone knew how to deal with trespassers who thought paperwork gave them power, it was him. I pulled out my phone again, not to call the sheriff, not to call the county, because I already knew how little help they'd be. I called Walter. "Grandpa," I said when he answered, my voice tight with anger, "they're back. With flags. Down by the creek." There was silence for a beat, then the calm, steady voice I'd grown up trusting. "I'll be right there," he said. And in that moment, watching those red flags ripple in the breeze like a threat, I knew the real fight for our land had just begun. By the time my grandfather's old pickup rumbled up the gravel drive, the so-called survey crew had already staked a dozen more flags. The creek bank looked like it had broken out in a rash of red. I stood there, arms crossed, phone full of photos, blood pressure climbing with every hammer strike I heard. Walter climbed out of the truck slower than he used to, but his presence carried weight. He didn't need to raise his voice or puff his chest, he just had a way of filling the space around him, making men think twice. "What's all this?" he asked, squinting toward the creek. "HOA patrol," I muttered bitterly. "They claim this land falls under their jurisdiction now." Walter's jaw tightened, and I could almost see the years roll back across his face, back to the days when he fought tooth and nail against developers trying to choke out the old families. "Well," he said flatly, "not while I'm breathing." He didn't waste time arguing with me. He just walked back to the truck, opened the rack behind the seat, and pulled out his rifle case. Now, let me be clear, Walter wasn't the kind of man who waved a gun around to scare people. He respected firearms the way a surgeon respects a scalpel. This wasn't about showing off. It was about making sure the strangers down by the creek understood one thing: this land wasn't abandoned, and it sure as hell wasn't up for grabs. By the time he strode to the fence line with the rifle slung over his shoulder, the survey crew finally stopped pretending I didn't exist. Their smug expressions melted into something else: hesitation. Fear, maybe. "You boys lost?" Walter called, his voice carrying across the creek like a clap of thunder. One of them, older than the rest, puffed his chest out. "Sir, this is a routine HOA survey. We've got authorization." He held up a stack of papers in a plastic sleeve, shaking it like proof. Walter didn't even look at it. "Authorization from who?" "Your homeowners association," the man replied. Walter chuckled, the kind of laugh that had no humor in it at all. "Son, this land has been in my family longer than you've been shaving. We've never been under any HOA. Now, you can hand those papers over for inspection, or you can start walking." The crew shifted uneasily, like they weren't used to being challenged. The older man tried again, firmer this time. "We'll just be a few more minutes. This doesn't need to escalate." That was when Walter finally lifted the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, just resting it against his shoulder, easy and natural, as if to say, "Don't mistake my age for weakness." "Minutes are up," he said. The effect was instant. The younger ones gathered their tripods, stuffing notebooks and tablets into their bags. Even the mouthy one hesitated, then finally yanked his flags out of the dirt. One by one, they retreated back up the trail toward the road. I stood frozen, half in awe, half in disbelief. It wasn't the rifle alone that sent them packing, it was Walter's presence, the quiet authority of someone who'd stared down worse men and lived to tell the tale. When the last truck door slammed and their convoy pulled away in a spray of gravel, I finally exhaled. "You really think that's the end of it?" I asked. Walter shook his head. "No. Men like that don't quit. They regroup." He spat in the dirt. "And when they come back, they'll have papers that look cleaner, maybe even a deputy in tow. That's how these games are played." He was right. A chill ran through me, not from fear, but from the weight of what we were up against. This wasn't just trespass. This was organized. Somebody with money and influence wanted our land. Still, I wasn't about to let Walter fight this battle alone. "I'll call the sheriff again," I said. "Make them send someone official." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. But don't expect help. The law has a way of siding with whoever's paying their dues." He wasn't wrong, but I had to try. When the deputy finally showed up an hour later, he looked more annoyed than concerned. His cruiser door creaked open, and he stepped out with a clipboard in hand. "Got a report of a disturbance," he said flatly. "Yeah," I snapped. "Those men trespassed on private property, drove stakes into our land, claimed the HOA sent them. I want it on record." The deputy scribbled something, not even glancing toward the creek. "Sir, if this is an HOA matter, it's civil, not criminal. You'll have to take it up with the board." Civil? I exploded. They were standing on my land. With equipment. Forged papers don't make that legal. The deputy sighed, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Look, I'll file it. But I can't stop an HOA survey. If they got documentation, it's their right. Walter stepped forward then, his voice low but sharp. Boy, do you even know where the HOA boundary ends? Because I do. This land ain't in it. So unless you want to explain to the county judge why you ignored trespass on record, I'd suggest you write a damn thorough report. The deputy's pen paused, his face coloring slightly. He muttered something about doing his best before retreating to his cruiser. As the patrol car disappeared down the road, I felt the frustration boil inside me. The law wasn't on our side. The county wasn't on our side. It was just us. And as Walter slid the rifle back into its case, I realized something important. If we wanted to keep this land, we'd need more than anger. We'd need proof. Evidence. Strategy. The battle hadn't ended with red flags being pulled. It had only just begun. The next morning, I found my grandfather already waiting on the porch, his coffee steaming in the cool dawn air. He sat in his old rocking chair, rifle case leaning against the rail beside him, as if he'd known I'd need him before I even called. They'll be back, he said simply, eyes fixed on the mist curling over the creek. I didn't argue. He was right. Men like that don't just pack up and disappear. They regroup, reassess, and return stronger. And sure enough, by mid-morning, a white pickup rolled up to the edge of our property. Out stepped two of the same survey crew from yesterday, this time joined by a new face, a tall man in a crisp button-down shirt, hair slicked back, carrying a leather binder like it was a badge. He had the smooth confidence of someone used to bending people to his will. Morning, gentlemen, he called as they made their way down the slope toward the creek. I'm here to clear up this little misunderstanding. Walter stood slowly, his joints stiff but his posture unbroken. I followed, heart pounding. This isn't a misunderstanding, I said sharply. You're trespassing. The man gave me a smile so polished it almost gleamed. My name's Rick Larson. I represent the Greenspire Development Group and the local HOA board. According to these records, your parcel falls under recent annexation. We're authorized to conduct preliminary surveys for improvements. He opened his binder, flashing a packet of documents thick with stamps and signatures. Walter didn't even glance at them. I don't care how many seals you print on paper. That creek isn't yours to measure. Rick's smile never wavered. He turned his attention to me instead, as though Walter's words were background noise. You're a reasonable man, I can tell. This process benefits everyone. Improved drainage, road access, property value. Property value? I cut in. You mean you want to carve up this land and sell it? Rick chuckled softly, like I just said something naive. Progress doesn't stop for nostalgia. You can either work with us and profit, or resist and lose everything. Walter's hand rested on the rifle case. He didn't open it, didn't need to. The weight of it was enough to change the air. I fought men like you before, Walter said, voice steady as stone. Developers with slick hair and false papers, thinking they could rewrite history with ink. My answer hasn't changed in 40 years. You step one more foot past that fence, and you'll regret it. The younger surveyors shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing they'd drawn a different assignment. Rick, though, stood his ground, smile tightening into something colder. You're making a mistake, he said, lowering his voice. The board has already approved this project. Neighbors have signed on. The sheriff's office won't interfere. You'll be outnumbered. I felt my stomach twist. His words rang too close to the truth. The deputy's dismissal yesterday suddenly made sense. This wasn't just trespass, this was a coordinated takeover. Walter must have seen the doubt flicker in my eyes, because he turned to me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. Son, remember this, he said. Paperwork only has power if we let it. They can print all the maps they want, but the land doesn't move. Boundaries don't change just because liars redraw them. I swallowed hard, nodding. His certainty steadied me. Rick closed his binder with a snap, his patience clearly thinning. Fine. Have it your way. But when the official assembly meets, don't say I didn't warn you. He motioned to his crew, and they trudged back to the truck, muttering under their breath. Gravel sprayed as the engine roared to life, the sound fading down the road until silence reclaimed the creekside once more. Walter finally sat back down in his chair, exhaling slowly. That's the real enemy, he muttered. Not those boys with stakes, him. He's the kind who hides a knife behind a handshake. I knew he was right. Rick Larson wasn't just another hired man. He was the orchestrator, the one pulling strings, greasing palms, manipulating neighbors. If we didn't find a way to expose him, he'd keep coming back, armed with thicker binders and bigger lies. I looked at the creek, at the red marks still scarring its banks, and felt something harden in me. This wasn't just about protecting family land anymore. It was about uncovering the fraud and fighting for everyone in our community who didn't even realize they were being duped. Then we'll fight smarter, I said. If they're using paperwork, we'll dig deeper. Find out who signed what, and how. Walter gave me a slow nod, the faintest spark of pride flickering in his eyes. That's the spirit, he said. But be ready. The truth doesn't scare men like Rick. It only makes them more dangerous. The creek gurgled quietly in the background, but I no longer heard peace in its sound. To me, it was a warning, the calm before a storm that was only just beginning. After Rick Larson's visit, the house felt different. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle in the trees outside, carried a weight. It wasn't just paranoia, it was the knowledge that someone was trying to erase our claim to the very ground we stood on. Walter stayed calm, but I could see the shift in his routine. He kept the rifle closer, the doors locked earlier, the porch light on longer. He'd lived through this once before, decades ago, when developers had tried to strong-arm families off their land. But this time, it wasn't just greedy men in suits, it was a machine dressed up as an HOA, armed with paperwork and neighbors' trust. I couldn't sit still. My background in construction engineering meant I knew how to read plats, deeds, and permits. If they were waving papers around, then somewhere in those records was a lie I could dig out. So I drove down to the county clerk's office the next morning. The clerk, a tired woman with reading glasses dangling from her neck, slid a stack of binders toward me. Annexation records, property transfers, HOA filings, she said. Knock yourself out. Hours blurred into each other as I flipped through page after page. Most of it was dry, legal descriptions, signatures, stamped seals. But then I found it, a petition to annex Lot 7B and adjoining parcels into the HOA's jurisdiction. Lot 7B. That was ours. The document had half a dozen signatures from supposed property owners, except none of the names belonged to us. And one of the signatures, shaky and uneven, claimed to be from an elderly neighbor who had died 6 months earlier. My pulse quickened. Forgery. I traced the paperwork backward and saw Rick Larson's name attached to the development group listed as consultants. And sitting at the very top, endorsing the annexation, was Darla Henson, the HOA president. Darla. The widow who had once seemed sympathetic, the one people in the neighborhood pitied because she'd lost her husband last year. I remembered her standing at community barbecues, soft-spoken and humble. Now her signature sat above the fraud that threatened to get our family land. When I drove back home with copies of the document stuffed into a folder, Walter was waiting. I laid the papers on the kitchen table, pointing at the forged names. They're faking signatures, I said, my voice trembling with anger. They even used Harold Peterson's name, he's been gone since January. And look, Rick's company is listed as the consultant. Walter studied the papers carefully, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up. So they're not just trespassing. They're stealing. That's exactly what they're doing, I said. And Darla signed off on it. Walter leaned back, letting out a long breath. I always told you, son, greed makes people do strange things. That woman lost her husband, and now she's letting a slick talker convince her she can fill the hole in her life with money. I wanted to believe it was more complicated than that, but maybe Walter was right. Grief and greed were powerful tools, and Rick Larson knew how to twist both. That evening, Walter and I visited a few neighbors, people we trusted. We showed them the copies, the forged signatures. Some were outraged, but others looked away, unwilling to take sides. One man muttered, "If Darla says it's good for us, maybe it is," before shutting his door. The division cut deep. Some of them were too afraid to oppose the HOA, others too blinded by the promise of rising property values. It became painfully clear, this wasn't just a fight over our land. It was a fight for the community's soul. Walter saw it too. Back on the porch, he cleaned his rifle in silence, then finally spoke. "They'll call a meeting soon," he said. "Darla and that Larson fellow will try to seal this deal in public. That's where we hit them, not just with guns, but with the truth. You bring the papers. I'll bring the backbone." I nodded, though my stomach churned. Exposing fraud in front of an entire assembly would make us a target. But it was the only way. The red flags may have been pulled from the ground, but the real markers, the ones drawn in ink and deceit, were still planted deep. And if we didn't rip them out, they'd grow roots too thick to cut. The community center hadn't looked this full in years. Pickup trucks and SUVs crowded the gravel lot outside, neighbors spilling in through the double doors, buzzing with nervous conversation. The folding chairs inside creaked under the weight of people who had come not just for an HOA meeting, but for a showdown. I walked in clutching my folder of documents, copies of forged signatures and annexation records. My hands were slick with sweat, but Walter's steady stride beside me grounded me. He wore his old denim jacket, the kind he'd had since the 70s, and he carried himself like a man walking into battle. At the front of the room stood Darla Henson, dressed in a tailored blazer, her silver hair pinned neatly. She didn't look like the grieving widow I remembered. She looked polished, rehearsed, and ready. At her side, leaning against the table with his binder, was Rick Larson. He scanned the room with a thin smile, the kind a predator wears when it knows the trap is already set. "Neighbors," Darla began, her voice warm but controlled, "thank you for coming on such short notice. We're here to discuss the future of our community. Progress is knocking at our door, and we have the opportunity to raise property values, improve infrastructure, and ensure our neighborhood thrives for generations." Polite applause rippled through part of the crowd. Others, like me, stayed stone-faced. Rick stepped forward smoothly. "Our surveys have confirmed that annexation of adjoining parcels will allow for better road access and water management. This benefits all of you. Of course, a few misunderstandings have come up, but tonight we'll set the record straight." He said it with such oily confidence I almost believed him. Almost. I stood. "Those surveys are a lie." My voice cracked at first but grew stronger as heads turned. "This land doesn't belong to the HOA, and you know it." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Darla raised a hand, pretending at patience. "Dean, this isn't the time for theatrics. If you have concerns, you can file them with the board." "I already filed them," I shot back. "The sheriff brushed me off, because you've got him convinced this is legitimate." "But it's not. And I can prove it." I marched to the front and slapped my folder on the table. Papers spilled across the surface, copies of forged signatures, highlighted annexation maps, dates that didn't line up. I held up one page. "Here's a signature from Harold Peterson. Problem is, Harold's been dead for 6 months." Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned, whispers rose. Darla's face paled, but Rick only smirked, leaning closer as if to remind her to hold her ground. Walter stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Who sold the creek rights?" he demanded. The room went dead quiet. Darla opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted toward Rick, then back at the crowd. Walter slammed his palm on the table, rattling the papers. Answer the question. Who gave away land that's been in families here for generations? A woman in the back shouted, I didn't sign anything. Another voice joined in, neither did I. The room erupted in shouts, neighbors demanding explanations, accusing, questioning. Rick raised his hands, trying to soothe the chaos. Folks, please, let's not get lost in emotion. There may have been clerical errors. Clerical errors? I roared. Forging the name of a dead man isn't an error. It's fraud. Walter's presence was thunder beside me, his voice ironclad. You think you can steal from us because you hide behind paper and titles? Not here. Not now. The crowd shifted. Where moments ago some had seemed persuaded by Darla's promises, now doubt filled their eyes. Anger too. Rick's polished veneer began to crack. He gathered his binder quickly, whispering something sharp into Darla's ear. She nodded stiffly, then attempted to gavel the meeting to a close, her voice trembling. This assembly is adjourned until further notice, she announced, but the words rang hollow over the rising tide of voices. Neighbors crowded toward the table, demanding answers. Some shouted at Darla, others cursed Rick. The room had transformed from controlled theater into a mob teetering on the edge of rebellion. Walter leaned close to me, his eyes fierce. We've lit the fire. Now we make sure it doesn't go out. As Darla and Rick slipped out a side door, heads ducked, the truth hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. For the first time, the community saw the cracks in the facade. And though the fight was far from over, we'd just landed our first real blow. The air carried a heaviness that morning, the kind that told you trouble was coming. Walter was already on the porch when I woke, his rifle resting across his lap. He wasn't polishing it or loading shells, just holding it, like a reminder to the world that he was ready. By noon, the sound of engines echoed up the dirt road. 3 white trucks rolled onto the edge of our property, each one stamped with a slick new logo, Riverbend HOA Development. Out stepped men in neon vests and hard hats, clipboards in hand, acting like they owned the place. Behind them, a black SUV pulled up. Out slid Rick Larson in his tailor jacket, sunglasses perched on his face, a smug grin plastered there like he'd already won. Walter rose slowly, every movement deliberate. He set his hat on his head, slung the rifle across his shoulder, and walked down to the creek with a steadiness that made the surveyors freeze in their tracks. This is private land, Walter said, his voice carrying over the water. Turn around. Rick chuckled, waving a hand like he was shooing away a fly. Come now, Walter. Don't make this difficult. We've got approval. Just a few measurements, nothing more. You'll see, this benefits everybody. Walter stopped at the edge of the bank, planting his boots in the soil like roots. You've got forged papers and a whole lot of nerve. That's not approval. The surveyors shifted nervously, looking between Rick and Walter. One muttered, sir, maybe we should, but Rick cut him off sharply. Do your job, he barked. That's when Walter lifted the rifle. Not at the men, not at Rick, just toward the sky. The crack of the warning shot echoed like thunder, rolling through the trees and scattering a flock of birds. The surveyors dropped their clipboards instantly, stumbling back toward the trucks. Rick's smile faltered. He held up his hands, voice tight. Now hold on. You fire that weapon at anyone, and you'll be in prison before sundown. Walter lowered the barrel slowly, his eyes locked on Rick. You step 1 foot past that marker, and I won't be aiming at the sky. I had my phone out by then, live streaming everything. Comments began pouring in as neighbors tuned in, people from the assembly just days earlier, and even strangers from nearby towns. The screen filled with words, stand your ground. Expose the fraud. We're with you, Walter. Rick noticed the phone, and his face twisted. Turn that off, he snapped. I didn't. Instead, I panned the camera across the trucks, the retreating surveyors, and then squarely onto Rick. Tell everyone watching why you forged signatures, Rick. Tell them why you lied. His jaw clenched, the mask slipping. You don't know what you're talking about. Walter's voice came again, calm but sharp as steel. We know enough. You used Darla to front your little scheme, you bought off the sheriff, and you thought you could scare us into silence. But this land isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. The comments exploded. Call the state. That's fraud. Lawyers are watching this. Rick realized then that the tide had turned. The surveyors were already climbing back into their trucks, refusing to step closer. And from the dirt road, more cars began arriving, neighbors, drawn by the live stream and the sound of that gunshot. They didn't come quietly either. Some carried phones, others carried anger. Voices rose as they approached, calling Rick out, demanding answers. Darla wasn't with him this time, she'd abandoned him to face the heat alone. Rick tried one last bluff. This isn't over. You people don't understand how contracts work. You'll be begging for my help when the county steps in. Walter shifted the rifle against his shoulder, tilting his head ever so slightly. The only begging I see is you trying to talk your way out of trespassing. The crowd laughed, a harsh sound, and Rick's face reddened. He scrambled back toward his SUV, slamming the door shut as the trucks peeled away behind him. The creek was quiet again, but everything had changed. The HOA's strongman had been humiliated, the fraud exposed to hundreds online, and the community had seen what real backbone looked like. Walter looked at me, eyes tired but blazing. This ain't done yet. But we just drew the line in stone. And for the first time, I believe we could win. For a few days after the standoff at the creek, the neighborhood simmered like a pot left on the stove. The live stream had spread far beyond our small town. By the next morning, it had racked up thousands of views, shared and reshared across Facebook, local forums, even the evening news. Everyone knew what Rick Larson and the HOA had tried to pull. Still, exposure wasn't enough. Rick was slippery, and men like him always had lawyers on retainer. If we wanted real justice, we needed to keep pressing, and that pressure was already starting to split his alliance. It started with Darla. Walter and I heard from a neighbor that she hadn't been seen outside in days. Her once pristine lawn went untrimmed, her curtains stayed drawn. Rumor had it she was ignoring calls from half the board. When I finally saw her at the grocery store, she looked worn down, the sharpness gone from her face. Darla, I said, blocking her path near the produce aisle. Why'd you let him rope you into this? Her eyes flicked around nervously before landing on the floor. She clutched a bag of apples so tight her knuckles went white. I didn't know, she whispered. Rick, he said it was all above board. He said the annexation was just a formality. You signed it, I said coldly. Her voice cracked. He told me it was just to streamline community improvements. Roads. Drainage. I didn't see the forged names until it was too late. I wanted to believe her. Maybe grief had made her pliable, maybe greed had blinded her, maybe both. But the truth was, she'd put her name on the line, and now she was drowning in the weight of it. A week later, Darla called an emergency board meeting. This time, no slick speeches, no Rick standing at her side. Instead, she read a written statement with trembling hands. I was misled, she admitted in front of a dozen neighbors. Mistakes were made. I resign as HOA president, effective immediately. Gasps echoed through the room. Walter leaned back, arms crossed, expression grim. Her resignation was more than a crack, it was a fissure splitting the entire scheme apart. Rick, of course, didn't take it lying down. Within hours of Darla's resignation, he stormed onto our property again, this time without surveyors, just him and his SUV. He slammed his door, his tie askew, sweat beading on his forehead. You think this changes anything? He barked. You think one old woman quitting saves you? I'll bury you in lawsuits. I'll drag you through court until your land is worthless. Walter stepped onto the porch, rifle slung casually across his shoulder. He didn't raise it this time, he didn't need to. His voice alone carried enough weight. Boy, I've lived long enough to know a drowning man when I see one. You ain't burying anyone. You're already sinking. Rick's jaw worked furiously, but when he caught sight of me recording again, his bluster faltered. The last thing he wanted was another viral clip of him threatening a family with baseless lawsuits. He spun on his heel and drove off, tires spitting gravel. 2 days later, the county sheriff showed up, but this time, he wasn't here for us. Turns out state investigators had gotten involved after someone sent them the livestream and forged documents. They wanted to talk to Rick Larson. By the end of the week, word spread fast. Rick had been arrested on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted land theft. Neighbors who once wavered started knocking on our door, some with pies or casseroles, others just with apologies. They admitted they'd been scared, that they believed the HOA's promises. Walter never gloated, he just listened, nodded, and told them, next time, stand up sooner. Don't wait for someone else to fight your battles. The land felt different after that. The creek ran just as it always had, the trees still swayed in the breeze, but there was a new kind of peace. For the first time in weeks, Walter put his rifle back in the cabinet. We ain't finished yet, he said one evening as we watched the sunset. But the hardest part's over. Now it's just cleaning up the mess. And for once, I let myself breathe. Because the truth had finally cut through the lies, and the fight was tipping in our favor. The storm had passed, but its marks lingered. Rick Larson sat behind bars awaiting trial, Darla had vanished from public life, and the HOA, once puffed up with power, now limped along with half its board gone. Neighbors were meeting not in secret assemblies, but in open gatherings, where voices carried more weight than titles. For the first time in weeks, the land felt quiet again. The creek sang its steady song, and the red survey flags were long gone, replaced by wildflowers sprouting after the summer rains. One evening, I found Walter by the water, hat tilted low, skipping stones across the current. He looked older somehow, not from the fight, but from the weight finally lifting. Funny thing about land, he said without turning. You think you're protecting it, but really, it's protecting you. Keeps you rooted. Keeps you honest. Reminds you who you are. I sat beside him, the smell of damp earth in the air. You think they'll try again? Walter's chuckle was soft but certain. Oh, there'll always be another Larson. Always someone who thinks paper's stronger than people. But long as you remember what we did here, they'll never win. His words struck deep, because this fight hadn't just been about deeds and boundaries. It had been about legacy, a family's right to hold onto the soil where their history was written. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had once doubted us began showing up at our gate, not with demands, but with offers. Some brought fence posts and tools to help repair what the surveyors had trampled. Others brought pies, dinners, or simply their presence, a kind of silent apology for standing by too long. One Saturday, we hosted a cookout by the creek. The same people who once cheered Darla's promises now raised glasses to Walter, calling him the backbone of the community. Walter, of course, brushed it off. I'm no hero, he said, poking at the grill. I just did what any man should when someone tries to take what ain't theirs. But to everyone else, he was more than that. He was proof that courage still counted, that one voice, one rifle, if need be, could stop a machine built on lies. As the fireflies lit up the dusk, I looked at him differently. My grandfather wasn't just a stubborn old rancher. He was a living reminder that land is more than dirt and water. It's memory. It's identity. It's family. Months later, after Rick's trial ended with a guilty verdict and restitution orders, the county officially struck down the fraudulent annexation. Our deeds were safe, our creek secured. On the day the news arrived, Walter didn't celebrate. He simply folded the letter, tucked it into the Bible he kept on his nightstand, and said, "Good. That chapter's closed." But I saw the way his shoulders eased, the way he lingered on the porch that evening, watching the horizon like it had finally given him peace. Years from now, when the grass grows taller and I walk this land with my own children, I'll tell them the story. Not of Rick Larson or forged papers, but of Walter, the man who stood when no one else would, who proved that legacy isn't protected by law alone, but by grit and will. And maybe they'll skip stones on the creek the way he did, feeling the same truth ripple through them. This land isn't just ours. We belong to it.